Good evening. My name is Cedric McCray. I am the interim director at the Office of Equity and Civil Rights. And I want to say first, thank you for joining us during our Fair Housing Film Festival. I have the honor of introducing our moderator for this evening. Ms. Adria Crutchfield is an affordable housing and community development leader with public service experience that spans federal, state, and local government, legislative, and executive branches. Since February 2019, she has served as executive director of the Baltimore Regional Housing Partnership, dedicated to helping families escape poverty through access to high quality housing in areas with strong schools, low crime, and ample job opportunities. Immediately prior to joining BRPH, Adria served as chief of staff at the New York City Department of Buildings, where she advised the commissioner on the administration and execution of agency priorities, including organizational restructuring, improving the safety and construction sites, and the mayor's goals to develop affordable housing, support small businesses, and build more sustainable and equitable city. Previously, Adria worked as a senior advisor to the executive vice president of capital projects at the New York City Housing Authority, the largest public housing authority in the country. In this capacity, she supported the day-to-day operations and management of the country. Management of 400 employees responsible for planning, designing, and delivering a $2 billion 5-year construction program. She had roles in external affairs, issue advocacy, and coalition building focused on improving the quality of life of vulnerable populations and creating vibrant cities. Adria serves on the board of directors for the Maryland Association of Housing and Development Agencies as well. As a graduate of Washington University in St. Louis, where she studied architecture, and American University, where she earned her master's degree in public policy. She is a proud alum of Coro Leadership New York. So without further ado, I would like to welcome and introduce Ms. Adria Crutchfield. Take it away.
Thank you so much, Cedric. Really appreciate the invitation to moderate tonight's panel. I can't say enough about how awesome I think that this film festival on fair housing is, that the Office of Equity and Civil Rights has put together for everyone. So thank you again for this opportunity. I am delighted to be here tonight with a distinguished panel. As Cedric mentioned, I'm the executive director of the Baltimore Regional Housing Partnership, also known as BRHP. And we work really hard to provide rental assistance and housing counseling support to families, primarily with children, who have low incomes. We help them access neighborhoods of opportunity. These neighborhoods are safe, healthy, and economically vibrant communities. And we believe that everyone should have the opportunity to live in those neighborhoods despite their income levels, where they come from, so on and so forth. So all the things that I hope you've learned this week as you've been engaging with this film festival. So I now would like to welcome our panel, Bill Kavanaugh, Gene Capello, and Michael Sussman, who are with me tonight virtually. Great to have you gentlemen here, and they will introduce one another. Bill, I'll turn it over to you.
All right. Well, thank you, Adria. My first job is to introduce Gene Capello, and I'd like to introduce Gene in the way that I came to know him. First, as my next door neighbor in Yonkers back in the 1980s, on a narrow stone path that led from the house where I had an in-law apartment to the house behind that where he and his young family lived. And then the next incarnation I came to know Gene in was as a community activist, because Gene, who was an attorney in corporate law in New York City and had recently moved to Yonkers, experiencing housing discrimination in the process, although I'm not sure that he was aware of it quite then until after he'd been in Yonkers a bit. Gene, at the same time that I did, became an activist in the struggle to fight City Hall, which had decided in the wake of the U.S. versus Yonkers case, to go into contempt of the courts in implementing the housing portion of the consent decree that that very council had agreed to only less than a year before. And Gene gave, as I guess those of you who have just watched the film, gave what for to his local councilman at a local community gathering, and began to activate, and this led to him becoming a member and then the head of the local NAACP in Yonkers, and a period of long city and county contributions. Gene, in addition to continuing his corporate law career, became member and president of the board of a hospital in Yonkers, and then eventually joined the Fair Housing Justice Center in New York on their board and became president of it as well. Gene has really been a major force in the New York City area, in the area of housing discrimination, fighting it, and making the area a better place.
Thank you, Bill. Thank you for the kind words. I get to introduce my old friend, Michael Sussman, who was our lawyer for many years in Yonkers and in the US versus Yonkers case. And I guess what I could say unequivocally is that Michael is one of the smartest and most able lawyers that I've come across. And I work with a lot of lawyers. And what Michael has chosen to do is to work for people who have been wronged in one way, shape, or form or another. And, you know, I suspect that, and I didn't know him then, but I suspect that Michael could have worked for any large firm, but chose to devote himself to working in the area of civil rights and working for individuals, ordinary working people. And many of them are people of color. And there's a price to pay for that too, because during the Yonkers case, I know that Michael's life was threatened many times. Death threats and threats of bodily harm just for doing his job. And he did it extremely well. He was a forceful advocate for the NAACP in those years, and he's been a forceful advocate for many people, individuals, and many families who often deserve justice. Michael's a Harvard Law grad, and I guess the best thing I could say about Michael is that if Joe Biden happens to become president, my recommendation to him would be to appoint Michael as the Attorney General of the United States. And there, everyone would see what real justice is like.
Well, great to be with all of you, two of my friends, and I appreciate what you had to say, Gene. I don't think it's likely to happen in this lifetime for reasons you've alluded to. When you do the work, you make many enemies along the way. Some friends and some good friends like both of you. I remember Bill Kavanaugh, we went over this before, but it comported with my memory from 1988. We were in the middle of the contempt period that he started speaking about and introducing Gene. And there's a guy with a camera who's in our midst. And I could see he was a scrawny guy at that time. He's not so scrawny anymore. None of us are, except maybe Gene. And there he was. And it took, I don't know, 20 years perhaps for this movie to be made. And I remember many consulting meetings and discussions with him over the years. And I was so impressed with his desire to get it right. The balance he was drawing in his own life between working for clients during the day, supporting his family in the business of filmmaking and public relations and production. And on the other hand, this public interested side of him, which is devoted, despite the odds, to finishing this film. And it's not the only film he's made in the public interest. He's made several that deal with housing discrimination. And for me, Bill, the most memorable thing is you didn't focus just on policy. As the movie demonstrated, as we talked about earlier, You were concerned about the real lives of people and how the work we were doing on a legal level was really impacting people. And I thank you for that focus. I think it's so important to keep everyone grounded. Many of the people we were working for in Yonkers, who you found, didn't even really know what we were doing. Really didn't. And in a way, through your movie making, they learned about the case and the opportunities of the case. So both of you, thank you. And I'm delighted to be part of this with you, Adria, and thank you for your work over the years as well. So we're ready to go.
Wonderful. So I had the opportunity to screen the movie on Sunday, and obviously a lot of parallels between the what happened in Yonkers and the origins of the Baltimore Housing Mobility Program, which BRHP administers. So I wanted to ask all of you, and we'll start with you first, Bill, what was the motivation behind your involvement in the documentary, or getting into filmmaking even, and wanting to share this particular story?
Well, I got into filmmaking because I wanted to tell stories about things that mattered to me. And I started working on this film really because at the time I had recently moved to Yonkers. And one of the formative experiences in my life previously to living in the New York area had been that I had summer jobs in the clerical warehouse at the Stop and Shop companies in South Boston during the 1970s. And I came to meet people from all over the city of Boston in the middle of the desegregation struggle there. And through that experience, I came to understand a little bit better about the diversity of experiences that people on one side or the other of the economic and racial divides in Boston had vis-a-vis school desegregation. But I thought, okay, this situation has been resolved, right? And then I found myself in Yonkers as a new resident in 1988, only to see that this omnibus litigation that Michael had entered in as a co-plaintiff was now going back over a lot of the same ground in the schools in Yonkers, but breaking new ground in terms of housing and being met with the same kind of vociferous, vituperative reaction that I'd seen in Boston in the 1970s. And I just thought I needed to pick up the camera and do something locally, not knowing that this was ultimately destined to be a 27-year litigation. And that, as Michael can tell you, you know, anyone involved was going to get a little gray hair in the process. But that's what got me involved in this particular film.
Michael or Jean, what about your involvement and wanting to share this story?
Yeah, I guess the only thing I can say is that we were newcomers to Yonkers when I moved there in the early 80s, having been you know, born in Harlem in New York and, you know, growing up in the city. Yonkers was a suburb which I knew very little about, but, you know, my family was growing and we needed space, and we decided to go to the suburbs, and I preferred north rather than east, where Long Island is, and really didn't know what we were getting ourselves into because we didn't know much about the town. But what I can say is that as we got more and more into this case, I dawned on me essentially that this is going to be historic in one way, shape, or form or another. And people often don't read about history. A lot do, but not everyone. But films are different. And if Bill was going to put together a film about what I think is one of the most important cases to come along in quite a while, and still is, I think it would be good to be a part of that. And, you know, I was happy to be a part only because I wanted people to understand what things were like back then from the standpoint of an ordinary resident. You know, I can't say much more than that. I think that it was good to be a part of it, but we all paid a price in doing it. Michael, I know, has a little different perspective.
Well, I think that there are two things that are important. One is demystifying the law, so people understand that with all the complications of the 27-year litigation, at the end of the day, it was an expose of racism, an expose of hatred, an expose of courage on the part of African-American people to stand up against that in the North, let that be clear, in the North. The second thing that's important is that there's a truth-telling function. When people ask me what's the legacy of the case, it's the long opinion of Leonard Sand as affirmed by the Court of Appeals, an almost 200-page opinion, which chronicles carefully 40 years of racist behavior and social life in the city. And for those who think this is all natural and the way things have to be, what that tells you is the decision-making that individual people in political power made, their decisions. That's what led to this strife, segregation, discrimination. And Bill does an excellent job of telling that and how it affects individual people. That truth-telling is crucial to getting beyond the racialism that we have in our society. We can't tell the truth about race. It's coming out now in the last number of months, and it's here every day. And that's what has to be done, and that's what that movie does, at least in part, for this case.
Absolutely. So Jean mentioned the importance of the resident perspective, and Bill, you focused on three residents of Yonkers in the film: Andrea Owens, Mary Dorman, and Jean and his wife Doris. Could you tell us a little bit about the importance of putting a face to fair housing, or putting a face to housing discrimination?
Sure. It took me a while to really find a way to connect an audience to what I was seeing and feeling as a filmmaker out in the field. I was going to talk to pastors who had been part of a ministerial alliance that had been active in Yonkers since the 70s. And I was talking with other activists like Winston Ross, who's no longer with us, and Herman Keith, who, struggled since the mid-70s to try to change things in Yonkers. And the more I learned about the minutia of this struggle, the more I realized that people have been pushing this rock up a hill for an enormous amount of time. And so my first instinct was, let me just tell the chronology of this, because it's monumental. Here we are at that point, in the beginning of my work, it was 88. And thereafter, for a couple of years, I started to create this compendium that, sort of could have looked like a book. And I was putting people to sleep with it. Because for most people, this is not what they live for. And so I started to go back and look at some of the folks I'd been talking to and try to profile them in more depth. Because the thing I began to learn was that everyone, Jean and Doris in their family, Adrene and her family, Mary Dorman on the other side of town, who was, activated by the folks who were really trying to manipulate poor white people on the southeast side of Yonkers. They all wanted the same thing for their family. They wanted a safe and constructive community in which to grow and raise their kids if they had them, and to feel a part of the community. But and so being able to profile people, I thought, might help an audience understand the similarities that everyone had across, class. I mean, Adrene didn't even know that the Yonkers case had existed until she became eligible among 200 in the end families who qualified for these units of housing that were being built. She didn't even know that she'd really ever been discriminated against, because as far as she was concerned, the only places to live were those places within, the hole, as they used to call Schlobohm, or, other housing developments in downtown Yonkers. Mary Dorman didn't know that people who lived in Schlobohm had very much the same experience that she had had when she lived, in above the animal hospital as a young woman trying to raise her family, and that they were all scrimping and trying to save for their children. And the difference was that the opportunity that Mary had was not there for a dream. Jean and Doris moved to Yonkers, and Jean can tell you a little more about it, but they were all told, oh yeah, you Capellos, right? Yeah, you come up and see the east side of Yonkers. Got some great properties up there. And then, he'd show up black and be told, we really have some great places in the southwest side of Yonkers to show you. There's all of this very complex nexus of institutional and private discrimination, really came down to changing the opportunities and lives of people, and pulling people apart. So I thought, well, let's focus on that, and then we can tell the story about leadership. Then we can tell the story about how, a small cabal of petty, local, sometimes corrupt politicians found their way to hang on to power was to divide people, and to use that very American and tragic racism that is so ingrained to distract them from being able to come together and build a better city. And I hope that was a successful approach.
I certainly think it was. I think the point that you make around those folks that you featured really having so much in common, wanting the same thing, that is so true back then and even today. And I think it's some of the othering and whether or not we know that those things are happening blatantly or not, or behind the scenes, and we don't even know they're happening, that keeps folks apart. So Jean, you lived the experience, and I would like to hear a little bit more about how the case impacted you personally and professionally, and maybe a little bit about your family's resolve to remain in Yonkers despite what was going on around you at that time.
I got involved when it looked as though the city was heading towards a crisis, because the council people had decided to repudiate the consent decree that they had already agreed to. And what struck me was that the way Yonkers was set up, there were 6 councilmen and a mayor. The mayor was, back in those days, what we call a weak form of mayor. He was like a councilman at large. And that was Nick Wasisco, who became a good friend. And when you think about it, since the east side of town and the west side of town geographically were very similar to the way this country is right now, the west side council people, which was much more integrated, should have been all voting for going along with the consent decree, and the east side people were opposing it. The problem was that my councilman at the time, who was on the west side, who should have been voting for it, was voting against it. So there was a 4-3 vote against it, which I thought was absurd. Why is this guy who is representing us voting with the people on the other side who were trying to, stiff the consent decree? So that essentially was why I got involved in the first place, to complain about who this guy was and why he's doing this. Throughout, I spent many evenings at council meetings and other meetings, listening to people go on and on about things, and, sort of stepping up and supporting Nick Wasisco at the time, who was trying to do the right thing. But, and in a lot of those meetings, it got very ugly. we got threatened. And, you know, there's a scene in the film sort of at the end when the two councilmen have changed their minds and that angry mob is outside and they're banging on Nick Wasisco's car as he's leaving. We were the car, my wife and I were in the car right behind him. And they did the same thing to us, which is, you know, a little bit frightening because you really don't know what this crowd is going to do. So, but having said that, you know, we thought we've got to do what's right. And, you know, people had struggled in Yonkers, people of color had struggled in Yonkers for many years, and we all deserve justice. And, you know, the best way to do that is through the courts if leadership fails us. And that's what happened. We were dealing with a failure of leadership. So having done that, and you know, and you know, fortunately coming out on the right side of the case, you know, from a personal point of view, it's kind of led me to continue doing things. And I think Bill mentioned that I'm with the Fair Housing Justice Center in New York, and the Fair Housing Justice Center fights systemic discrimination in housing in 12 counties in the New York area. We're a small organization, a small civil rights organization, but we've been extremely effective in doing that. And, you know, if I had not had my baptism of fire in Yonkers, I may not have been part of Fair Housing, but I'm happy to do that. And I would invite any of our viewers tonight to take a look at the Fair Housing Justice website. It's fairhousingjustice.org. and see a little bit about what I think is a very effective organization that other communities would want to, would think about joining. You also mentioned professionally. I can say that, you know, without going into a lot of detail, it actually did threaten my job at the bank that I worked at the time. But fortunately, the people who were my boss at the bank, when they threatened to pull, well, I should backtrack. Where my bank was, that I didn't really know this at the time, but we were the ones who offered the bonds for the city of Yonkers. And as I and another colleague of mine became more outspoken during this thing, they told my counterparts there that, you know, if we didn't shut up, they were going to yank the business from the city. And I had a visit from one of the bankers telling me that, and she said, you know, I'm not telling you what to do, you just need to know this. And so I spoke to my boss, the general counsel, and explained the situation to him. And he said, you know, without thinking twice about it, he said that you do what you need to do. If they're going to do that, it's not the kind of business that we want. So, you know, I had no thought that it might actually lead into my professional life, but it did. And, you know, when people start playing games, that's the kind of thing that you have to be prepared for.
Absolutely. Just, you have a really courageous story, really courageous, and to have persevered despite that, it's inspirational. Michael, I wanted to ask you, how have you seen progress? Maybe we'll start there. Have you seen progress towards the creation of diverse communities, be that in Yonkers or other cities across the country since the making of the film, perhaps through the litigation efforts that you've been involved with for years, or through other civic action by everyday people?
Well, I think this festival is being held at a crucible time for the country. Your question is really a question of our times. Yeah, yesterday, the NBA players didn't play playoff games. Today, I believe it's the same thing. Some of the Major League Baseball teams didn't take the diamond. So what I feel, honestly, is that as with any movement, it's a long time coming, but all of the work we've been talking about contributes through its truth-telling to the end result of a movement toward justice. I don't think it's come quickly enough. I don't think that it's in any way ineluctable or inexorable or inevitable. In New York City, I've been fighting a case in the last year dealing with the Inwood neighborhood, which is a neighborhood 70% Dominican and probably 20% African American. And in that neighborhood, a major upzoning has been proposed by the de Blasio administration. You may know about this from your previous work in the city. It's one of a number of upzonings that the de Blasio administration has supported. The community has resisted it because they feel it's a way of displacing in Manhattan people of color from a stable neighborhood where they've been able to live. The issue, the narrow issue, has been whether the city in doing this even has to study the socioeconomic impacts of its plan. And the first court said, yes, they did. And the second court said, no, they don't. And my response to that is, you're not even going to study the impact of what you're doing on people of color at a time when we're asking our institutions to be responsive to these individuals in a way that they've never been before. It's as if you want to define them as invisible. So I don't have the most optimistic view of this, quite honestly. At the NAACP national office, where I was for 5 years from 1981 to 86, I found a tired attitude back then, 35 years ago, on these issues. Many people of color at that point that I was working with felt that integration, desegregation, housing justice were not the most critical issues. More critical was voting rights, for an example, and voting rights was seen as something which required homogenization and segregation of the population so that you could elect a person of color from a district. And if you desegregate, then how do you ever do that? I heard that over and over again in those years. And in the 35 years since, we've had an African-American president for 8 years. I can't honestly say that he was particularly committed in any strong way to these issues. I think he was conscious of them. I think he cared. But in terms of programmatic address to racial segregation, to police misconduct, police brutality, I don't think you could make a credible argument that that was done and that there was a commitment. Now, yes, Republicans obstructed him in Congress. I know that. But the bully pulpit of the presidency was not used in it over and again for this purpose. On occasion it was. So I think there's a lot to be said. It's a very complex set of issues, but we have a long way to go. Maybe we're moving there more quickly now. But lives are still being taken, and the taking of lives, it seems to be what's catalyzing us, as with Emmett Till in the 50s, right?
Right.
We need George Floyd to die. We need Mr. Blake to die. We need this person to be shot. And that gets us moving. As in 1968 with Dr. King, what inspired the Fair Housing Act, Gene?
Yep.
Right? Someone's death.
Nation.
Someone's death.
I'm reminded, Michael, of what you said to the local NAACP at a meeting that I attended many, many years ago after the case had been decided,
Yep.
but before the city had agreed to actually build the housing. And you said, this case doesn't just get resolved in the courts. The courts react to pressure. And if you folks aren't still out, pushing this in the community, in protest, in demonstration, in every way, putting it in front of people, our politics and our courts don't move.
I've always had that view, and I've said it when I ran for New York State Attorney General in 2018. I said the same thing when I traveled the state. We're not going to have change unless people mobilize and are, as Gene pointed out, persistent over years and are angry. There's a lot to be angry about. There's a profound anger and rage that has to be expressed in our body politics. I don't say it has to be expressed through violence. John Lewis didn't express that through violence, the contrary. But there has to be a tremendous sense of energy and urgency about these issues because they're affecting children. Adults can be affected. They're affecting children. Housing segregation affects children and their life opportunities. So to me, the moral imperative of this comes from that as much as anything else.
For sure. There's lots of hard data out there to show the impacts of segregated communities on children, for sure. We're now starting to get some questions from the audience. And so I'd like to take a moment and remind the audience that you can certainly send the panel your questions. I'm going to take two here. The first one, is it even possible to improve and bring resources to an area without gentrifying and pushing out long-term residents? Won't an influx of capital always drive up rent and housing prices and therefore box out the working class?
I guess I raised the issue with Inwood, so I'll briefly address that. The answer to that question is no. There can be countervailing public policies that ensure that the infusion of capital on the one hand is counterbalanced by an assurance of actual affordable housing and real housing opportunities. One of the critiques of the New York City programs is that the quote affordable housing doesn't come close to reaching the needs of the actual people in the community. It's at a far higher level. That's all our decision making again, as I said earlier. This comes back to what we decide, how we use our resources. So no, there's nothing inevitable about that.
And,
Yeah, and I agree
and
with
I
that
think,
because I think we make mistakes sometimes in just thinking about people of color only in certain terms, only in terms of, affordable housing, for example. And affordable housing, makes sense, but often the affordable housing that's being built is being built in the same neighborhoods that have been suffering. And what we often need to think about is building affordable housing, dare I say it, in low poverty areas, because that's often where the opportunities and the schools and the parks and all of the amenities that people want for life are often in those areas and not necessarily in the poorer areas. We've got to find ways to stratify the situation. We've got to be able to give people opportunities in places other than those that have been ghettoized. So what this all takes is leadership. And often the things that Michael is talking about result from a failure of leadership. People who are afraid for one reason or another to take the daring step to do something for people who don't always count. So I have to agree that it doesn't, the fact that building reasonable housing doesn't necessarily mean it's always going to be gentrified. That's a choice that people often make, and our leaders often make, and it leads to, the situations that we have and the failures that we have.
Bill, did you have anything to add before I take the second question?
well, I just wanted to say briefly that I think one of the other issues that we don't often address when we talk about fair housing is that class in America is something that has been used by those who are most powerful, developers, not unlike the one who now occupies the White House, to basically take advantage and exacerbate racism in order to take property, in order to take land. I mean, you know, in most countries in the world, the ownership of land means that you and your descendants will have a certain class, and that does not change. In America, we attempted a great experiment to develop a broad middle class, and imperfectly did so. And we're in the process of abandoning that as well. And one of the consequences, or I should say actually one of the means by which that's done, is to divide people in order to take property. And before I go too far down that road, I just think those who think there's nothing that can be done, I would say don't despair, organize.
Appreciate that for sure. This next question is from Tony. Do you think there should be or could be a lawsuit for forcing the study of the efficacy of these types of programs? And perhaps these programs might mean the remedies that come out of the lawsuits, for example.
Could you repeat that? It wasn't entirely clear to me.
Sure. Is there a way to litigate, I think, the forcing of a study of the efficacy of the program? So is there a way to compel a municipality perhaps to evaluate, one of the remedies perhaps that integrated housing or ensuring voucher deconcentration or those types of things? Thoughts on that?
Briefly on that issue. The Fair Housing Act has had an affirmative obligation on communities now for 50 years that requires communities to assess the scope of their public policies in this area to ensure that they are affirmatively fostering the objectives of the Fair Housing Act. When Gene Capella said, I would be Attorney General, the reality is if I ever was Attorney General, I'd make sure that that part of the Fair Housing Act was actually followed, which it has never been followed. Again, in any administration, there's been no aggressiveness. When we talked about the Inwood matter earlier in New York, one of the things I said to the court was New York City won't even study the impact of its programs on people of color. How can they ever know whether their programs are fostering or retarding movement in this direction? Doesn't make any sense. So yes, absolutely, you can use the courts to do that. But again, as Gene said earlier, you need not to separate the courts from the people. This has to become something people care about and speak about and advocate for.
And you need leadership in order to do that. Michael's right. This has been on the books for over 50 years. The act is very clear. It says that leaders, et cetera, and municipalities should affirmatively further fair housing. It couldn't be clearer. Yet no one has decided to follow the law. So what good is it if it's black letter law, but no one wants to enforce it? So that's where leadership comes in, and we've had too many people who have not been able to do it. There was a glimmer of hope in the second Obama administration to start down that road, but it came too little and too late for anything to happen. Although I do give them credit for at least starting that discussion. And I know some municipalities started speaking about that, including New York City. But that all changed in 2016. All of those rules were changed by the current administration, and that's not surprising.
So we only have 3 minutes left in this panel discussion, and so I just want to give you each about 45 seconds to leave us perhaps with a final thought, given what you've mentioned about organizing and holding leadership accountable in the upcoming election. Any final thoughts, each of you?
Bill?
Well, I would say, to pick up on what Gene and Michael have both been saying, leadership is extremely important. I mean, the one thing that my experience working in Yonkers on this film left me with was to understand that, leadership can bring people together and leadership can help tear people apart. Racism is a burden that this country continues to bear and inflict upon its citizens, and it won't change overnight, but leadership can have a dramatic effect in terms of how we address our legacy, how we address the history as we understand it, so that we can make a better America, make a better country. And I'd just leave us with that.
I think, what Bill says is right, that, the United States has never gotten over its race issue. The history of the United States started with slavery, and in certain forms, it's still with us. If you look at the prisons and you look at housing, and housing to me is one of the most important things, because outside of, your daily sustenance, what's more important than housing? Because it dictates not only where you live, but it dictates a number of things: who your children go to school with, et cetera, where they go to school, what amenities are available to you, whether you actually have a decent place to live. And too many people are consigned to substandard housing, or housing that is way too expensive for them to literally survive. And I know we've talked a bit about leadership, but I think one of the things that we need to do is to face this issue. And it's going to take sacrifice. And it's going to take sacrifice. If we're talking about people of color, it's going to take a lot of sacrifice on behalf of white people to understand the privilege that they have. And it's going to be difficult for them to come to terms with that. But if enough people do that, we might be heading in the right direction. I am somewhat optimistic because the lead in what's been going on since the George Floyd murder has been leadership from young people. And I'd like to think that that generation is heading in the right direction and will have a better view of how equality works than my generation, for example.
This has to
Thank
be,
you. It's time. We're at time. So sorry to interrupt. I think that's a great note to end on. Oh, I'm getting a note. We can keep talking. Go ahead, Michael.
well, I just
Please.
wanted to say that I think that there's two major issues. One is the intergenerationality of this, and the fact that we can't simply say the young. The young are doing a marvelous job. They're working together, but we have to stay as part of the struggle and not cede it to any one generation. It's everyone's issue. Second of all, to my white brothers and sisters, as Jean said, it's on us. It's squarely on us to deal with these issues right now. If you don't see where we are and what we've done collectively, if you don't see the nexus between your own private sentiments and racism and government policies, if you don't see the simultaneity meaning across all spheres of our social life, whether it's criminal justice, whether it's municipal employment, whether it's housing, employment, schools, these issues permeate all of that. You may be interested in housing, Jean, but people can make the argument that employment's the most important sphere, because without a good job, where are you? And yet we have pervasive employment discrimination. So the point is, whatever your interest is, bring your passion to the table and work for change. And that has to happen. It has to be pervasive. Many white people today are waiting for this period to pass so we can go back to business as usual. If we let that happen, we're mad. That's my view.
I appreciate that. No more business as usual. I would be happy to stay on longer with you, gentlemen. This has been a great discussion, and we so appreciate the audience tuning in. And again, a big thank you to the Baltimore City Office of Equity and Civil Rights for hosting this film festival. Have a good night, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Adria.
Gentlemen, thank you, Rita.